For a younger generation, the name Alexander McQueen might be that of a brand that makes thick-soled sneakers. But we want to tell you about Alexander McQueen, the genius and the rebel. More than fashion shows, he created art installations. And more than fashion, he made dreams. His creativity was boundless, his irreverence well known, and his tragic passing in 2010 shook the fashion industry. So, who was Alexander McQueen? And why do his collections and fashion shows still make waves today? Why did the designer, at the peak of his career, take his own life? Keep watching to find out. Welcome to La Gazette, your source for fashion, beauty and Parisian lifestyle on YouTube. No olvides que tenemos subtítulos en español. Et nous vous rappelons que nous avons également des sous-titres en français. Let's dive straight into the story of the larger-than-life Alexander McQueen. Lee Alexander McQueen was born in Lewisham, London, youngest of 6 children in a family of modest means. Since he was young, he was interested in clothes and, funny enough, in birds. As you will discover, birds will be a huge part of his work as a designer. At 16, he left school to go work and learn the trade at Savile Row, the street in London reputed for housing the best tailors in the world. Funny story of his time at Anderson & Shepherd, one of the tailors where he worked, he claims to have sewn obscenities inside the lining of a suit for Prince Charles. When he was 21, he joined the prestigious design university Central St. Martin's. He initially applied to be a tutor of pattern cutting, but given the quality of his portfolio, he was encouraged to enroll to the Design Master program. After school, he started making a splash in the industry right off the bat. His graduation collection, entitled Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims, was bought in its entirety by famous fashion editor Isabella Blow, who became close friends with the designer and helped launch his career. It is said that it was her who suggested in the first place he used his middle name for his brand. So the Lee was dropped and Alexander McQueen was born. His first collection after graduation was presented in Paris, with other young British designers at the Ritz. But we will never get to see it because it was stolen right after the presentation. So if you ever come across a garment with some hair sewn inside a plastic square, hold on to it. It might be one of the stolen McQueens. Because yes, he used hair instead of a label in reference to the Victorian tradition of keeping a lock of a loved one's hair after their death. His first solo runway show was entitled Nihilism. It was for the spring-summer 1994 season, and we didn't know it back then, but this collection represented the birth of a silhouette. In fashion, the creation of a silhouette is no small feat. In an industry where everything is cyclical and things just come and go in and out of fashion, the designers who can actually say they have created something new are few and far between. And Alexander McQueen is one of them. He's the father of the low-rise pants, or bumpsters as he called them. His version was so low, models had to do a bikini wax to wear them. And when they turned around, it was easy to understand why they were called the bumpsters, as, well, the bum was quite visible. Critics laughed and criticized the silhouette, but then Madonna wore them in an ad for MTV in 1994, and the rest is history. But McQueen's notoriety was only beginning. For Fall-Winter 1995, he presented a collection entitled Highland Rape. The models wore clothes that were slashed or spattered with fake blood. Plus, they had disheveled hair. Critics were instantly outraged by the show, and they treated him of misogynistic for making rape glamorous. He objected to these critics as his intent was to portray the rape of Scotland by the English, when they killed the Scottish clans in what was almost a genocide. He was also referencing his personal history of sexual abuse when he was a young boy. He answered questions on this subject without his face on the frame because at the time he was still getting by thanks to unemployment aid he was receiving from the government, and he didn't want to be recognized by them. He would be called misogynistic on several occasions after this. A journalist at the Daily Mail went as far as to say that McQueen was the designer who hates women. He, however, would often say that he liked to portray his women strong and even scary. In his opinion, anything was better than making them into romantic, fragile beings, as other designers will make them out. He often portrayed them as warriors. His following shows were acclaimed and continued to raise his profile. His Fall/Winter 96 Dante collection was shown in London and New York, and that year he won the British Designer of the Year award. 1996 was also a big year for the young designer, because he was appointed creative director at Givenchy, succeeding John Galliano, who was leaving the post for Dior. Hubert de Givenchy called his appointment at the time a total disaster. McQueen's first collection for Givenchy featured an Icarus, perhaps letting people know he felt he was flying too close to the sun and was afraid to get burned. While it was not very well received by the press, his work for the Maison in general was met with success and acceptance, especially his haute couture, where his genius found the able hands it needed to express itself. His aesthetic was not very appreciated in Paris at the time when the minimalism of Helmut Lang was all the rage. If you want to learn more about the king of 90s minimalism, we have a video telling his story. Click here to watch it later. McQueen left Givenchy in 2001 after his 5-year contract was through. In an interview, he said he didn't know how he had managed all that time. He was only 26 years old when he started, and with his own brand to manage as well, he had to create a total of 14 collections per year. This onerous work pace might explain the start of his drug addiction around this period. While he was working overtime for the French Maison, his work for his own brand continued to grow in creativity and brilliance. His Spring-Summer 99 collection, entitled Number 13, had one of the most famous fashion shows to date. The show featured a model who was a double amputee wearing wooden legs, making him one of the first inclusive designers. This, however, is not the reason for the show's notoriety. At the finale, model Shalom Harlow steps in the middle of a rotating platform in a white dress, while 2 car-painting robotic arms spray her with yellow and black paint, giving the dress its final touches on stage, in full view of the public. This is one of the most famous show finales in fashion history. Another iconic fashion show was his Spring-Summer 2001 collection, Voss. Before the show, the press was seated in front of what they thought were mirrors, where they could look at nothing but themselves. This really amused Alexander McQueen. The lights inside the mirror were suddenly lit and the roles were inverted. Only the press could look into the runway, but the models stepping into the runway saw only themselves. Nature inspired this collection, and we could see it with the use of feathers and even clam and mussel shells. Models were told to destroy these dresses on stage. This was meant to represent the self-destructive and ephemeral nature of fashion. The finale was no less memorable than the show. The glass box in the middle of the runway shattered to reveal a naked model with a glass mask and hundreds of moths. The tableau was based on Joel Peter Whitkin's image Sanitarium, and it was meant to critique an industry where you could be beautiful on the outside but rotten on the inside. Other memorable finales include the Fall/Winter 28 Joan collection, inspired by Joan of Arc, where a model walks in the middle of the runway and a circle of fire illuminates around her, and the Fall/Winter 2006 Widows of Culloden, which feature an hologram of Kate Moss as a ghost widow. At the time, this was seen as the comeback to modeling of Kate Moss after a cocaine scandal. In 2000, Alexander McQueen sold 51% of his brand to the Gucci Group, which would later become Kering. This gave him the freedom to do the shows he dreamed of without having to worry about the financial aspects of the company. Some of his most memorable shows of the next decade include the Spring 2005 It's Only a Game, where models played a life-size game of chess, and the Spring 2008 La Dame Bleue, inspired by and dedicated to Isabella Blow, who had committed suicide a few months before, and as you remember was a very close friend of McQueen. The theme of birds in his collection was completed by hats by their mutual friend Philip Tracy, who had also been a protege of Isabella. His Fall/Winter 2009 show, The Horn of Plenty, was one of the most important of his life. He said in an interview he wanted this to be the last show of the first half of his career. his last show as the enfant terrible of fashion, and the start of his maturity as a designer. The stage featured a mountain of garbage composed of references to his own previous shows, such as a chandelier or a piece of chess from It's Only a Game. Some say this show was also his way of giving fashion the middle finger, as some looks were clear references to some of the most famous silhouettes in the 20th century, but deformed. We could make out Dior's new look, Poiret's silhouette, Chanel's tweed, Balenciaga's volumes, and even Valentino red, the only color other than black and white. The color scheme was taken directly from the racist scene at the movie My Fair Lady. The makeup of exaggerated red lips was inspired by Lee Bowery. And funny story, he said he wanted to give his bow after the show in a rat costume, climbing the trash pile, but he decided to go out in a shirt at the last minute. His last women's wear show was meant to be the first of his new era as a designer. The Spring-Summer 2010 collection was entitled Plato's Atlantis, and it was inspired by Darwin's evolution and a post-climate change world, where humans would have evolved to adapt to the rise of the seas. It was a collection full of McQueen's most iconic elements: water, present in his clothes and especially in his shows, like the notable Untitled collection, where rain falls down, and this is actually meant to be P, as the show's original title was Golden Shower, but let's call it rain. And it's also present in ponds and pools. The hair and makeup were also meant to represent the possible evolution of the human race in this dystopian future. And the shoes, well, those shoes. They are probably one of the most famous shoes ever designed. The famous armadillo shoes were made of wood and were inspired by this little animal. They were so high that 3 models refused to wear them. Another pair of the collection were 3D printed, which at the time was an ultra new technique. And the innovation didn't stop there. The show is also famous for being the first ever to be live streamed online on showstudio.com, Nick Knight's website. The photographer had also created the video playing in the screen behind the models. When asked why he decided to stream it, McQueen said it just made financial sense, as the show had cost nearly $1 million to produce, and this way, more people would get to feel the impact of the show at the same time. The stream didn't go smoothly, however, as Lady Gaga announced her new single, Bad Romance, was going to be revealed at the end of the show. To no one's surprise, the traffic driven by the pop star crashed the site. On a personal note, I can share my experience of the show as I was there, amongst the lucky to have seen it live. I confess I wasn't invited at all, but sneaked in at the entrance, and I sat on the second row behind Anna De La Russo, and I had my mind blown by what I saw. I was a student back then, and I remember that show as one of the moments that made me decide to pursue a career in fashion. What we saw that day on stage was close to magic. I remember having chills in my arms, and I remember vividly everyone clapping and standing at the end, and people around me talking excitedly, especially of course about those shoes. And we all knew that we had just witnessed something special, and sadly we didn't know at the time just how special it was. The last collection before Alexander McQueen's death was actually a menswear collection. He presented it in Milan for Fall/Winter 2010, and it was entitled The Bone Collector. The perfectly tailored suits, shirts, pants, and even the runway itself all featured a print motif of bones and ropes. Death had been a constant theme in McQueen's collections. In 2003, his skull scarf became one of his most iconic pieces, and it was part of every celebrity wardrobe at the time. The skull theme came in jewelry, clothes, shoes, and his famous clutch, popularized in street-style looks by Anna De La Russo herself. Even in the makeup of his shows, he favored ivory faces with no reliefs and no color. For this reason, the bones and ropes on his last menswear collection surprised no one. However, 3 weeks after it was presented, and the day after his mother's funeral, Alexander McQueen overdosed and hung himself. The date was 11 February 2010, and he was only 40 years old. Less than a month later, during Paris Fashion Week, the unfinished collection in which he was working was presented to a small room of journalists. Entitled Angels and Demons, it consisted of 16 pieces, heavy on golden embroidery and religious references. The industry was sad and shaken, but, like fashion, life goes on. 6 months later, his right-hand woman at his atelier, Sarah Burton, presents her first collection as creative director of the brand. She had worked with him for most of his career, and she knew the McQueen design essence better than anyone. Today, she carries his vision for sharp tailoring and dramatic silhouettes into the future. A little more than a year after McQueen's passing, the Met Costume Institute celebrated his work with the exhibition Savage Beauty, which broke attendance records for the museum. The genius of Alexander McQueen is hard to summarize in a single word, but it's undeniable. He didn't create fashion, a word he hated. He created worlds, visions, and dreams. His creativity is one of the most inspired of his generation, and his talent for both tailoring and storytelling are undeniable. His shows were so full of references and so thought out, we could write individual analyses of each and every one of them, a legacy that will be studied and revered by generations to come. If you're intrigued by his work and would like to know more, we recommend you watch some of the many documentaries on him available online. We will leave a couple of links in the description below. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And while you're down there, subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss our next fashion history videos. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram for more fashion. Thanks for watching!